My name's Candy Richards. I'm the Development Manager for East Anglia here at the Federation of Small Businesses, or FSB for short. So what is FSB? For those of you that aren't members, FSB is the biggest business membership organisation in the UK, solely focused on supporting small businesses and sole traders. So what do we do? So we campaign and we lobby on behalf of small business owners for changes to legislation and policy to better support small businesses. And we have a wide range of membership benefits, including 24/7 legal support, a library of templates and documents and policies that you can use to support your business, tax investigation support, free business banking, and much, much more. And this all starts from under £200 a year. So if you would like to find out more, you can drop me an email at candy.richards@fsb.org.uk. So welcome to our webinar, which is all focused on supporting you as a business owner to create a company that can thrive without you. Whether you're looking to build value into your business so that you can step away from the business in the short, medium or long-term future, or whether you want to create a business where you can step back and get a little bit more of that freedom that you crave, that was probably the driving force for you setting up your own business. So our coach today and our host for the webinar is Phil Budd, who is an FSB member, but also a renowned high performance business coach who works with a wide range of businesses, all shapes and sizes and all kinds of sectors. So Phil, I'm going to hand over to you, but before I do, I just want to flag that we do have a Q&A box on your screen that you can use if any questions pop into your head during the session. We'll try and take as many of these questions as we can throughout the session. So just bear with us if we don't get to your question straight away. So thank you. So Phil, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you've got a cup of coffee. Looking forward to some really good learnings with you this morning. Before we kind of bring up the slide deck and I give a little bit more background about what I do, I think it's important we give some wider context building upon what Candy's talked about. Being a business owner the last few years, and I say this with a slight wry smile, has had its challenges, I'm sure you would agree. COVID, inflationary pressures, economy, recruitment, the list can go on, right? And we want this to be a positive session, not a highlight of the negatives. But the reason why I mentioned that right at the start is because I meet a lot of business owners, and the reasons why you go into business are really clear when you start. Then when you get into year 3, year 4, year 5, you're kind of scratching your head a little bit thinking, okay, what am I doing here? Where is it going? And what I've seen over the last few years since the pandemic in particular is that a lot of business owners are really reflecting that question very deeply. And they're saying, where am I really going with the business? What does the future look like? Now, I want to highlight this right at the start. Some of the content that we're going to go through is focused on how you build value for the future. And you might be thinking, well, I don't know if I want to sell it. I don't think I'm ready to sell. That's the very reason why you need to be on today's webinar, because it isn't about selling tomorrow. It's about starting to work on the business to build the value for the future. And there's a lot of business owners that I meet that when they are ready to sell, they struggle around it. So this is about putting you in the best possible position to create the freedom as you build, but also as you build it and get to that point of deciding what I want to do with it, you've got options when it comes to that. So I'm going to bring up the slide deck now so you can see it on screen. Can they just give me a thumbs up that that's come up okay? Good. We're technically working well, which is a good start. So just to build on Candy's very kind introduction, in terms of a little bit further background around what I do. So I'm a business coach and high performance coach. And as I've helped business owners create a business that's more profitable and one that grows, what's happened within the coaching relationship that I've developed with business owners is I then end up coaching the management team and the team within that business. And the reason why that's the case is because that will accelerate the growth and the development of the business further. So there's a number of different parts to my business. I'm an action coach, qualified action coach, and I use their IP around how to grow a business. I'm my own independent business as well. And I use a value builder system, which was founded by John Warrillow, who wrote a book, Built to Sell. Fantastic book. If you've read The E-Myth, I highly recommend that book. But both, if you haven't read, definitely get on your reading list. So Built to Sell by John Warrillow. And a lot of the founding principles of what I'm going to go through with you today are based on John Warrillow's principles. In the last 18 months, I've developed my own academy. I'm very passionate about generating the next generation of leaders and those within employment, and giving individuals that are coming into work the opportunity to grow and to develop. So a mixture of what I do is around one-to-one coaching, group coaching, but also developing team members from what you can see on the screen. But those principles are really what I do as a coach. It's about faster growth, increased profits, and creating a business that is less reliant on the business owner. So time is our most valuable asset. You've got up maybe a little bit earlier, or you've put off a meeting that you were due to go to, or you've kept your diary free specifically for today's session. I want today to be a really good use of your hour. So there's a few points I want you to consider here on screen. The content is designed to get you to think and reflect. I'm going to be doing the presenting, you're going to be doing the work. What I mean by that is you're going to be doing the thinking and thinking, how does this relate to my business? What does this say about where I'm at now and where I'm going in the future? Now, I want the session to be interactive. I don't want this to be about me transmitting information to you for the next hour. So I want you to share your thoughts and questions. And if you want to challenge some of the comments, challenge them, and we'll have a good open dialogue with that. Candy's going to sort of look after the Q&A section. So put those in there. And during the course of today's session, we're going to be having those questions come through during the course of the hour, not wait till the end. And during each section I'm going to go through in today's slide deck, it's going to ask you questions for you to build upon that reflection and kind of create a little bit of a scoring mechanism for you to see where you're currently at now and what help you might need to move your business forward. Now, I'm a big fan of this. At any webinar, there's a danger you can go away and think, where do I even start? Right. And we don't want it to turn into an overwhelm session where you think you've got too much to do. We want to drill it down into fundamentally what action are you going to take to move your business forward. So don't take pages of notes. And I don't share the slide deck for the very reason that you'll ask for it, but you'll never look at it. Simply make 2 or 3 points that you think, do you know what, that really resonates with me, and I can see how that's going to move my business forward. It's all about the action that you take from today's session. Now, this was mentioned. I just want to highlight this briefly because this is a really important part of today's session. A great opportunity now is to look at what the current value of your business is based on some key metrics that I'm going to go through today, and see what that demonstrates in terms of value, but also what you can do to move your business forward. So I've agreed with the FSB. I'm happy to provide a free business valuation report for your business. And on top of that, a complimentary consultation of 2 hours with me to go through the report and look at where you can move your business forward. And that just provides an outside perspective and helps you to think about different areas that you may not have considered because you're in the business day to day. There's a QR code there to scan to a page which will allow you to request that. We're going to put that link within the Q&A area as well, but also my email details there as well. We've gone in a very robust way for 3 different options to make sure it all works. So that option will be available to you at the end of today's session. Now, straight away, we're going to make this interactive. What does freedom mean to you? In the Q&A section, I want you to list what freedom in business means to you. Now, to get you thinking, because it's a little bit early still, right? Get the cogs moving. I'll put a few ideas up there that I hear a lot from business owners. The ability to switch off from the business, the ability to choose how much I want to work. The business works for me. Having clarity about the future for me and my business. So in the Q&A section, just take a moment to define for yourself what you believe freedom in business is about for you. Now, this might link back to why you set the business up. It might be something that you're thinking about now. But just take a moment, and Candy will read those out once they come through, Candy, if that's okay. The other ones that I've got kind of listed there, the financial means to do what I want. No more team or people worries. How many of you have got people worries at the moment around recruitment, retention, trying to get good people that care about the business as much as you? I can see the Q&A boxes starting to move.
We've got some great responses coming through, Phil. So someone said travel, the ability to travel. Someone said not worrying about paying themselves. Someone else has said switching off even for just a week away. Freedom means choice. Freedom equals time and choosing how to spend it in and out of the business. The ability to earn what I want without restrictions, financial freedom and travel. So some sort of themes there around, you know, the ability to have that autonomy and to travel. I think there's lots of people with the appetite to travel at the moment.
Yeah, I completely get it. Now the weather's started to go really cold, you know, it's going to fall off a cliff this week, isn't it? From 20 degrees to about 3 degrees. Completely get it. It's that freedom of choice. I think that's what that highlights in summary across everybody. And I think that's the main reason why we all go into business and we come out of employment. We want to feel more in control of our destination than out of control. I just want to kind of share with you the sort of the stark reality for many business owners, right? And this isn't to build fear, but this is to understand the reality for many small businesses. And I'm talking about most businesses, I would say up until about 5 million turnover. The business is dependent on you. And for many business owners, they get stuck in knowing how to take it to the next level. Then there becomes a point over a period of years where you get to a point where you start to resent the business that you've built. And then because of that resentment, you suddenly say one day, I just want to get out. And then because you're doing it partly out of desperation, because of that reason to get out, you then struggle to sell the business because it doesn't have value and is too dependent on you. And the longer that process goes on, it's like when you're trying to sell a house to a certain degree, the more disgruntled you get and the lack of effort you put into the business. No different selling a house. You kind of think, I'm not going to do any more to doing it up. I'm going to wait till I sell it. Well, the business then can start to go backwards, which then makes it even harder to sell. And suddenly you're in this situation where you'd built an okay business, but you don't seem to have any options. You feel stuck. Now, like I say, this isn't scaremongery. This is just giving a reality check. This is why I do what I do, because it's so important that when you make that decision to set a business up, you're building something that's going to give you freedom and financial security for the future. And today's going to be about showing you the mechanisms and the elements that make your business build value, create you the freedom, but gives you options in the future. I just want to re-highlight this point. This is so important for today's session. This isn't about being ready to sell now or deciding that you're even going to sell in the future. It's about working on the business now to give you options in the future. There's nothing worse, and I'm sure Candy meets a lot of business owners in this situation as well, where the business owner doesn't feel like they've got any options. That is a horrible feeling to be in. So by looking at the elements that build value, you have choices, and choices make you feel in a greater level of control. So just a few things again to reflect that you might be in what we describe the owner's trap. This is where things like you are the primary salesperson for the business. Now, you'll be surprised to hear that even multi-million-pound businesses, it still can tend to be the salesperson or the founder or the business owner that is the salesperson. Now, when you first set your business up, there's a tendency to try and offer everything to everybody. Now, I'll say this with a wry smile because I meet a lot of business owners like this, and I reckon Candy will relate to this. You get a good customer on board, and they ask you, can you offer this service? And you can't offer it, but you decide to make your services bespoke so you can. And then another customer asks for something again bespoke. You then go down that route. And before you know it, rather than having standardization in your business, you've got 15, 20, 30 different flavors of what you do. And as you grow, you realize that this is causing you more problems than it's worth. And the customer won't pay any more for it. So you feel stuck. You're over-servicing them. It's bespoke. It's causing you operational problems. And you're thinking, how do I get out of this? So offering too many products or services can be a challenge. Only the owner can deliver. How many of you are in a situation with your team or with your business, if you haven't got a team, where you're thinking, okay, I can't get a team member to do it. It's got to come back to me. Maybe it's dealing with a supplier. Maybe it's dealing with a customer. Maybe it's to do with making the decision. Here's the other thing. Owners interface with the customer. I see this a lot. Again, I say this with a slight wry smile so it doesn't come across heavy. Business owners can't or don't always want to step back. They've got a team that are looking after the customer, but they can't resist getting involved. So what this just highlights to a degree is the trap that business owners can fall into. Now, let's just kind of give an element of balance here. As a business owner, you offer incredible value to your business. You started it, you founded it, you've got a significant amount of drive. But I want to be really clear on this point. To get your business to build value and be less dependent on you, you have to build a team that allows you to step back. And you have to learn how to step back, delegate, and learn to say no. Now, that can be challenging. It's what I help business owners with. But that is ultimately how we achieve that freedom. It's all about the team that you build around you. Now, here's some other things just to highlight the impact of this. The business slows when the owner is away. Maybe when you go on holiday, you try and switch off. When you come back, you come to a load of problems, or maybe revenue's dipped while you've been away. And when something goes wrong, well, the customer comes to you. And if you're not around in the business, then the revenue plateaus. I hear this a lot. Business owners feel that they're the ones driving the business forward. So let's talk about what is the ultimate freedom. And then we're going to go into the drivers that are really going to impact that. So the ultimate freedom is to own a valuable, sellable business. And what makes a business sellable? One that is not dependent upon the owner. So if we can focus on building a business that is less reliant on you as the owner, you get more choices. Now, at this stage, you haven't got to decide if you're going to sell it. I want to reconfirm that. This is about giving you options. But think about this, that when you are not operating day to day in the business and the business is less dependent on you, well, then there's the opportunities to scale it greater. Maybe you can pass it down within the family. Maybe you can put a management team in place that then will take ownership, and there's a management buyout, or what we call an employee owner trust type option. And then when it's got to a point where it's operating without you, you can operate more the role as a chairperson or standalone investor and director, whatever works for you. But what we're focused on here is the freedom has to be about removing you from the business. And the way that we do that, we're going to talk through today. So owner dependency is a major driver of the value of your business. What else drives that value? Well, the Value Builder system that I'm going to go through with you today has been operated with over 60,000 businesses since 2012. And there's 8 key drivers through this learning experience of building value within businesses that we're going to cover today. So I'm just going to go through these, summarize them one by one. And then what we're going to do is break them down in detail and then give you some key reflective questions during the hour that we've got today to get you thinking about where you're currently at with those areas. So first one is financial performance. Then we've got growth potential, the Switzerland structure. That sounds a bit strange, right? But I'll talk about what that really means. The value teeter-totter, reoccurring revenue or recurring revenue, monopoly control, customer satisfaction, hub and spoke. Now, if you decide to go through the Value Builder score report, you will get a score for your business in these specific areas, as well as a valuation of where you're at now and how you increase them. But we're not going to do that in the webinar. That's going to be after, in terms of what I'm offering. But today we're going to kind of look at those areas so you understand them or have an idea of what they mean and start thinking about, and give you an idea of where you might currently be at. So let's talk about financial performance. Thinking about this from a buyer's perspective, what a buyer will look at when you eventually come to sell your business is they're going to be thinking, how much profit is in your company? How much will they generate in the future? Or how much will the business generate in the future? And how reliable are those investment estimates? Now, the reason why a buyer will look at those things is they will be considering, how quickly am I going to get a return on my investment? So if I buy this business, how quickly am I going to get that back? Now, within the financial reporting process and your financial management, what a buyer is looking at is risk and balance of risk. They're looking to understand how risky your business is from a financial perspective. Now, I think this is important again to call out that if it's your business, there's an emotional attachment to it. To an acquirer, there may not be. Now, that may mean they may not be the right buyer, but I want to be clear on this, that this is a transaction for a lot of buyers in terms of how they're going to accelerate their growth strategy within their group of portfolio of businesses. And it's kind of, whilst that might be uncomfortable to hear, it's important that we're real about it at the same time. So how do you have good financial management in place? Here's some reflective questions. Score yourself a point for each statement you can agree with. Now, in the Q&A section, I want you to detail anything that seems obvious that you don't have in place. So Candy, read those out as they come through. It might highlight some other areas as well. Cash flow forecast in place, predicting your cash position over the coming months. Now, I speak really candidly. I should have said that from the start, right? So I'm going to be really candid about this. Main reason why businesses don't do a cash flow forecast is they're scared of what it tells them. And in some instances, don't know how to do it or feel that it's not applicable to their business. But that cash flow forecast looks at the predictability of those revenues and it gives a buyer confidence, but also where you're currently at within your business, it gives you confidence of knowing what your cash position is going to be. Profit and loss report generated monthly, used and understood. The amount of businesses I meet where they do a P&L only at the end of the year. That ain't any good if you're running a business. You need to look at it monthly to understand what you achieved. Just to break this down, because sometimes I get asked the difference between the reporting. A budget gives you an idea or tells you what you want to achieve. A cash flow forecast is estimating whether you're going to achieve it. And your P&L tells you what you've actually achieved. So that's that third report, a budget. Do you have a budget in place for what you'd like to achieve? Cash flow forecast to keep you on track if you're going to achieve it, and a monthly P&L to measure whether you've achieved it. Debtors report produced and a process in place to monitor debtors. You constantly having to chase debt. Is there a process around that? Are you aware of how much money is overdue? Gross profit and net profit margins are monitored. Do you know the difference between gross profit and net profit, and why is it important? Fully compliant accounts managed by an excellent accountant. Now, you might be thinking, well, what do you mean by an excellent accountant? When you come to sell your business, having a good accountant on board to support the process is really important. But also for any growing business, having the support of a proactive accountant makes such a difference in terms of the support you receive. So maybe this is making you think, do you know what? I've been stuck with my current accountant for a while, and maybe there's an opportunity to move. There's great accountants across the region and across the UK, to be clear. But you might be thinking, where I'm at the moment, I need to change. But are those accounts in good order and they compliant? Is your cost base regularly reviewed? Are you looking at your fixed and variable costs? When was the last time you did a review of that? Labour utilisation sounds a bit buzzwordy, right? Let me explain what that means. We're talking about capacity for workload and margins. So labour is an investment. It's a cost to the business. So based on the labour that you have and the productivity that you're getting, how does that measure up? What level of productivity should you get? And that's where we start talking about labour utilisation, getting more for your money. Do you know your break-even point? And finally, do you have a company dashboard highlighting key performance indicators that give an overall view of how your business is performing? So I'm just going to summarize those again. In the Q&A box, just kind of mention anything that stands out to you or any thoughts that's triggering. And again, Candy will read those out. But we're talking about, in summary, good financial reporting, cash flow forecast, P&L, budget, managing your debtors, knowing your gross profit and your net profit, having fully compliant accounts, cost base is regularly reviewed, knowing how much labour you've got and what the capacity for work you have based on that labour resource, knowing your break-even point, and having a company dashboard. Now, all of this stuff might seem glaring in the office. Very few businesses have all of this in place. That's the reality, because of that dependency that business has on you. And often you're doing a role within the business opposed to just running it. So let's look at the driver 2, growth potential. This goes back to that model that I mentioned, that often when we set a business up, we like to sell loads of things to one customer. Now, the challenge with that in terms of scalability, whilst we might think that drives profitability, it can cause challenges in terms of profitable growth. And what we want to focus on is selling one thing to lots of customers, becoming very clear in our focus. Now, I want to highlight the benefits of this. This isn't about purely driving profitability. this is making it easier to market. Now, marketing at the moment is one of those areas that a lot of businesses are looking at and saying, I need to cut back spend to maintain my profit levels. Marketing is an investment. Now, when you have a narrow product focus or a narrow service focus, it makes marketing easy. How many times have you gone to think, I need to market my services or products, but thought, where do I go? What do I market? Because the offering is so broad. So when we become very specific in the area that we focus on, it makes marketing a lot easier, as well as drive profitable growth. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight at this point is around scaling your business, about looking at 3 key elements, which is having a business and looking at models within your business that makes it more teachable than providing purely products or services. So is there an element in what you can develop and how you operate that become teachable? And the reason with that, if it's teachable, it's repeatable. Second point is aligning your scale to your business and your product and service offering to your most valuable customers. A really great exercise to do is to look at your customer base, list out your products and services that you're providing, and look at them based on profitability and saying, are we selling a lot of what isn't profitable to customers that don't pay very much? And looking at that and saying, how do we go after more of our valuable customers with products and services that drive higher margins? Now, this is the third one I really want to emphasize. This is all about repeatable business. One of the key ways you build value in your business and make your life easier to a certain degree is if you can create repeatable or recurring revenue. Now, some of the businesses that are on today's webinar, maybe you're an online business, maybe you're a product-based business on Amazon, and maybe to a certain degree, it is a one-off purchase. Well, there could be other products you're offering which does make it repeatable. But the repeatable element does affect the valuation. The more repeatable the business is in terms of the amount people order from you, that does have a massive impact in terms of the multiple valuation that you'll receive at the point of selling. So here again is a little bit of a score chart, just for you to step back, reflect, and think about your business, where you're at. This is all about identifying and achieving the potential growth in your business. Is there a documented 5-year business plan? Now, again, a lot of business owners, they've got a business plan in their head, but it isn't documented. Do you do an annual strategic planning session? Are they held with your team? Do you have a short-term 90-day plan? Do you have a documented sales process in place? Do you have tracked and monitor sales numbers? Do you know what your conversion rate is from lead through to client? Do you have a CRM in place in terms of managing your database? Do you have a documented marketing plan? Do you track and monitor your marketing numbers so you know what your ROI is on your marketing spend? Do you have a recruitment plan in place so that as the business grows through more sales, you know how you're going to add further roles? And around profit, as you grow the business, is it truly profitable growth, or is it purely top line revenue growth? Now, I'm highlighting these things because, again, the reality is when you come to sell, and the reason why many businesses struggle to sell is because a potential buyer will look at these things and say, these are opportunities for me to add value, but they directly affect what I'm thinking I'm going to offer for the business. So when we're talking about business valuation, the analogy I always use is a bit like selling a house. The house will have a valuation based on market value. But what does selling a house come down to? What someone is prepared to pay. And what buyers will look at is these things based on balance of risk to say, what am I prepared to pay based on what you have in place within the business? Driver 3. We're good for questions so far, Candy? I just want to check in.
Yeah, we've got some feedback, Phil. So someone says they're a sole trader, head down working day to day, and we hear this all the time. You know, when you're a sole trader in particular, you're so busy running the business, you know, doing all the other stuff, the stuff that you need or know you need to have that you've covered. It can be really difficult finding that time. But They said they've got no budget or forecast, but they have got a good accountant and produce reports once a year. So on the road there. And then someone else has scored themselves too. But obviously today is about highlighting other areas that they can build on as well. So yeah, thanks for the engagement. And if anyone else wants to share in the Q&A, do let us know and I'll feed that back to you, Phil.
Really good. And look, great comments. And what I again want to highlight is, let's not get to driver 3 and think my business is a mess. Phil's highlighting, I've got none of this in place. I'm scoring 1s and 2s. This is about opportunities to improve. This is why we're having this webinar now. You may be at the stage where you're not ready to sell. Now there's the opportunity to do something about it. You don't know what you don't know. That's the point of this session. And creating that time, and that point that I made around time is your most valuable asset, particularly when you're a sole trader or very early in your business journey. That time management piece is really important. It's what I work very heavily with business owners on. So the third drive that I want to talk about is the Switzerland structure. Now, again, that sounds a bit of a strange term. I said that at the start. What we're talking about with the Switzerland structure is about independence. If you take Switzerland as a country, it remains independent. And that's the point that we're trying to convey when it comes to the business. We want the business to run independently without you. So the goal here is neutrality. And what we want to look at around here, I'll just go through some key elements here, is we want a business that is able to switch between suppliers very easily. We want a customer base that means that it's not making up 15% of your revenue or more, because that means it's dependent on one customer and makes it very fixed. And we want to avoid over-reliance on any individual employee. Now, for some of the bigger businesses on today's webinar, you might have individuals that, because of their head knowledge and their experience, you feel really reliant on them. And maybe you feel at risk within the business because you have that reliance on those individuals. So what we're trying to do within the business is move away the dependency on suppliers, customers, and employees to make it run independent. We want it to be neutral in that sense. Now, there's a great quote here. This is an individual based in the States that went through the Value Builder system. And I just thought his words were really interesting, which you may relate to if you're a bigger business. So they took on a person. I equipped this person to be my right-hand person, and I gave them absolutely everything. And this was probably one of my biggest mistakes. Kind of more abdication than delegation. How many of you have been in a situation where you bring on an individual, you give them maybe too much responsibility too soon, and actually it ends up damaging the business rather than helping it? So what we're talking about here is effective delegation and not abdication of responsibility. Now, here's just a really simple exercise to take back to your businesses and work on. I want to give you some practical elements that will help you get clarity around this. So rank your employees, customers, and suppliers on difficulty to replace. Which customer is going to be difficult to replace? Which suppliers are difficult to replace? What employees do you feel dependent on? Now, that as a starting point gives you the clarity of where you need to start. And from there, you can build the plan. But a really simple exercise to help understand that dependency that the business might have, or the independence that it has. So what we're trying to create here, just to reaffirm it, is a business that operates with you, without you, and that is independent. Again, I've got some rhetorical questions here just to think about and score yourself again. This is what a buyer is going to be thinking about, but this also are elements that are going to help create the freedom for you now as you build and grow the business. You are not actively involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Now, if you're a sole trader, you're going to be at this stage. But if you're a bigger business, how much elements are you still involved day-to-day within the business? Do you have a management team in place? Are sales generated without you? Day-to-day decisions do not require your input. How many of you are still going to get involved in day-to-day decisions, even though you've got a team? You can take time off when you want. There is no reliance on head knowledge within the team. That goes back to the point about certain team members feeling as though they hold the power because they know how things work, because none of it's documented. Do you have stability in the team? Or have you gone through a period over the last few years where there's been instability, a turnover of staff? Now, that's not necessarily your fault, for want of a better term. But the reality is stability in the team creates the ability to grow sustainably, profitably on the long term, but also makes you attractive to a buyer. Multiple roles are not being fulfilled by one person in the team. Now, again, Rise Smile, as a business owner, you probably wear 10 or 15 different hats at the moment. But within your team in particular, you've got to look at that and say, what roles are we looking to recruit next? That means actually we've got people doing specific roles within the business, and we're not overloading the team, and we're not overloading myself.
Bill, on that, obviously we've got some sole traders joining us today as well. So in terms of these questions, how would you say they apply to sole traders? Is it looking at those areas that can be delegated to other sort of experts, for example, an accountant, or getting someone freelance to come and help with your sales or your social media?
It's a good call, because I think that when you're a sole trader, the reality of taking someone on can seem quite daunting, and it can feel as though, when am I ready to make that step? So certainly outsourced arrangements, whether it be, for instance, utilizing virtual assistant type services or subcontractors that are done more on an hourly or a day rate, what that allows you to do is not invest too much in the business that damages cash flow, but still create capacity at affordable level. And I think the question for any sole trader, bearing in mind that when you set a business up, often as a sole trader, all you want is to get volume of work in to fill your day-to-day schedule. And what sometimes sole traders don't think about, this is just from my experience, is, well, where am I going with this? Is this going to become a limited business? Is this going to come to a point where I have got a team working for me? And the challenge as a sole trader, if you remain a sole trader, well, a lot of that work is going to be dependent on you. Now, that might be fine for you. That's for want of a better term, a lifestyle business. If that's your ambition, then great. What we're trying to focus on within the webinar is getting to the point where we're giving you more freedom of choice. And the challenge when you're a sole trader is you can't take time off, or when you do take time off, you have no revenue coming through because you are the business. So the freedom directly comes in scaling the business to the point where you are not responsible for doing the work. So if you're a plumber, if you're a builder, if you, for instance, do design work, whatever it might be, or architect, for instance, it's looking at that and saying, okay, how do I build this business so others can do the work rather than me doing the work? So driver 4, the valuation teeter-totter. Now, what are we talking around this? We're talking about the balance between value and working capital in terms of cash needed in the business. Now, I appreciate we've got a wide range of businesses in today's session, or on today's session, and you might be a service-driven business that doesn't require a huge amount of working capital. Equally, you might have a relatively large team to support your business needs, in which case you do need a large amount of working capital to support the costs within the business. The reality is, let me make this really simple. The more working capital that a business needs to function day to day, the less value it typically attracts as a valuation. And the reason for that is, if I was to buy your business or invest in it, fundamentally, I'm going to have to put a lot of money in to keep it going. So we want to understand the impact that working capital has on the value of the business. So part of this is looking about cash flow. Now, again, an interesting quote from an individual that had gone through the value builder system, based in the States, and looking at the value, you might be thinking, I ain't going to get anywhere near 165 million. But put that to one side. What we're looking at here is his keywords. This individual did 2 important things. We looked for areas that we could charge money up front. And second, we optimized our all-in cost per acquisition to under a certain amount, where we knew that similar competitors in that space were spending 300 to 500 more in the same channel. So this is about cost of acquisition of a client. What they did is they charged up front and reduced the cost of acquiring a new client. So their marketing costs were low. So what does this mean for you? Well, again, some things to consider. Are you an ability, or do you have the ability? Could you create the ability for customers to pay up front or within a month's upfront notice? Now, a number of businesses feel hesitant in doing this, but I see so many businesses struggle because of poor cash flow management. And if you take the reason why businesses don't succeed, it isn't because they lack profit, it's because they lack cash. And a lot of businesses end up bankrolling their customers. Now, I'll be really firm about this. That isn't right. That isn't right. And we have to get a balance where, okay, based on trust with your clients, you're giving them options around payment terms, but we have to protect the cash flow within the business. So is there the option for customers to pay up front or a month in advance? Do you have set payment terms that you stick to with your customers, and do you stick to them paying within those terms? Could you get customers on direct debit? Is there minimal outstanding debt? Do you have negotiated payment terms in place with your suppliers? And is there a small or no cash gap? I'm going to take the slides off for a second. We're going to go flip chart. So what we talk about in terms of the cash gap. The cash gap is the gap between money going out and money coming in. Now, I want to explain this point a little bit. So if you are paying your suppliers up front, so for materials, if you're a tradesperson, if it's a product, you're buying stock up front, how long does it take for you to sell the products or services that you purchased? What's the time gap between that? And then this is the important thing. In terms of you then being paid, what's the time scale on that? Now, the longer the cash gap from money going out to money coming in, the more working capital, forgive the writing, clearly, the more working capital you are going to need. So looking at how quickly you're paying people and negotiating better terms with suppliers, so having money go out less often and getting customers to pay quicker, we reduce the cash gap. And this at the moment is so important for businesses. I talk about this so much because you have to protect the interests of the business. And is this a bit uncomfortable sometimes? Yeah, it can be. But you have to protect the interest of the business in terms of how it works. Now, for those, I'm conscious we're coming up to nearly quarter past. Some of you, I hope you're going to stay to the end, but I just want to put the on the Q&A section, the form details if you want to request that valuation report and that one-to-one, because you may need to jump off just before 1:30 if that's the case. But I hope you are able to stay to the end, but I just want to put that on there. We're now going to go back to the slide deck. Hopefully technology doesn't let me down. That works, Candy? Give me a thumbs up. Are we back on? Good stuff. So cash gap we've talked about. The business is not highly geared. We talk about high debt to equity ratio. So we're talking about their loads of debt and finance. So some of you may have bounced back loans and CBILS, completely get that. But is that proportionate to the value within the business, the equity you have, or is it disproportionate? VAT and taxes are paid up to date and on time, and you have a profit bank account in place. What we talk about that is you're segregating your money coming in. So you've got an account for working capital, an account for profit. So again, just look at those areas and think, okay, what do I score on those areas? Is this creating, by way of reflection, areas that I've been meaning to get around to, but haven't done so yet? Next point, reoccurring revenue. This is driver 5 that affects the value of your business. Now, we're looking at some key elements here. We're not going to go into loads of detail because the valuation report explains this in a lot more detail, but we're looking at the different types of reoccurring revenue. So basic consumables, a bit like when you go to Starbucks and buy a coffee. Committed to buy consumables. If you've got an espresso machine, a coffee machine like me, then that's an example of that. You're committed to buy on a regular basis because it's a replenishable amount, a replenishable product. Magazine subscription. So when you subscribe to a publisher maybe for 1 or 2 years, then we've got sunk money subscriptions where we pay a one-off cost for them. And then we've got auto renewal subscriptions like with an app or with other softwares that you might purchase. And then we have what we call multi-year contracts. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this is a lot of businesses have what we call goodwill in their business, which is there's no commitment from the client to buy from them again. It's just simply goodwill. That again directly affects value of a business. But when we have contracts in place, repeatable, recurring, returning revenue that increases the value. But most importantly, while you're growing a business, it gives you consistent cash flow because you've got reoccurring revenue that is coming in. So again, just a few questions here for you to think about. Are customers contracted? Could you contract them? Do customers need to buy more than once? Do customers need your services on a regular basis? When you win a customer, do you keep them? Or are you winning customers and then losing them at the back end? And do you know what the lifetime value of a customer is? Again, these are all things to help you now grow and build a better business. Driver 6, monopoly control. We're not talking about the board game, to be clear. What are the benefits of differentiation? Now, we're talking about here a virtuous cycle. When we create differentiation, we create controlled pricing. We can in effect name our price. Now, when we name our price, we can have higher margins. And when we've got higher margins, we've got more money for marketing, which then goes round as a cycle. Now, some of you will be on today's session thinking, well, Phil, this monopoly element you're talking about, whatever it means, I don't see how that's relevant to my business. Loads of people do what I do. Loads of people do what you do, but how do you do what you do differently? Let me explain what I mean. I remember years ago, this is a true example with a plumbing business. Plumbing business was struggling to differentiate themselves, and they found themselves competing in a price-driven market. And during the coaching process, he was looking at it and saying, how do we create a differentiator? And the differentiator came from understanding what customers need and want and what they're not getting. Now, without being disrespectful to a lot of trades, because I could get loads of abuse at this point, but one of the frustrations we sometimes have, I know I have, is having a tradesperson turn up on time, say they're going to do it, and do it. So what this plumbing individual did, looked at that and said, well, I can guarantee that I'm going to turn up on site within 15 minutes of committing to that client. And I'm going to offer that as a guarantee. And if I don't turn up on time within 15 minutes of that commitment, the first hour of my services is going to be on me. How many tradespeople commit to that? Not many. What differentiator does it make? Huge. What's the value? Huge. People value their time. For a busy person, knowing that someone's going to turn up on time is worth more to them. When it's worth more, they'll pay more. When they pay more, you've got higher margin. So as much as this is difficult to think, how do I relate it to my business and create that differentiation? This is where the thinking process has to come in, looking at what customers need and want and how you can differentiate that. Now, I'm going to use an actual example as another example, for instance, with Apple, HP, and Dell. Apple was seen as elegant and simple as a brand. HP was seen as technically innovative, and Dell owned direct-to-consumer benefits. Now, if you're Panasonic as a separate brand, what would you do? Compete on price? Do you try and be elegant and simple? Do you try to be innovative? Or do you try to go after the direct-to-consumer benefits? Well, this is what Panasonic decided to focus on. They saw an opportunity within the market that there wasn't tough laptops. So for those on construction sites, those going out on sites that needed a really robust laptop, there wasn't anything out there. So they created something that was very differentiating within the market, but they also created something that customers care about very, very much. So again, this is just an interesting example. You might not be a Panasonic, you might not be an Apple, right? But the point and the principle being is you look at the market, you look at where people are competing, but you look at how you can be different and what customers care about. Now, in that, you create differentiation. And in that, you move away from price competition. So how do you create a niche, or have you created a niche? Here's some questions to think about where you're currently at. Give yourself 1 point. Is your product and service different to your competitors? Is there a clear marketing message about how it's different? Are you offering what customers need and want? Is the customer clear on how your offering adds value? You're not competing on price. Now, if you are competing on price, can't score yourself a point there. You are raising prices a minimum of once a year. I love a good price increase for clients. Price increases at the moment are a real challenge because prices aren't going up in proportion to valuation to inflation, which means you are making less for doing the same amount of work. That does not make sense. The way that we do that and charge more is building more value and differentiation. That's when you can start charging higher fees. The price increases are above inflation levels. That links in with the point I just made. So think about where your business is at. How do you score against those areas? Driver 7, customer satisfaction. Now, this gentleman introduced something called the Net Promoter Score. You may have heard of it, you may not. Let me give you a little bit of background. So this individual, Rachel, developed a standard to measure the benchmark companies on willingness to recommend that's used by larger businesses. So this is basically how likely are you to refer or recommend a product or service? And he developed it for a lot of larger businesses. And that's the question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or colleague? So we're looking at really customer feedback here, but in a way that is scoreable to understand what level of service or product you're providing is meeting that customer need and demand. Now, how this works from a practical perspective is the respondents fall into 1 or 3 categories. So a promoter score of 9 to 10, a passive score of 7 to 8, or detractors 0 to 6. And what you do within this net promoter score exercise is you take the number of promoters and subtract the number of detractors, which will leave you with your net promoter score. So here's a practical example. 25 would promote the business in terms of services, 70 were passive, and 5 were detractors, which means the net promoter score was 20 because you're taking the 5 away from the 20. So we've got an idea what that net promoter score looks like. Now, here's just an example across larger brands that we're familiar with of what that net promoter score looks like in 2021. The average for that industry was 44. Apple scored 47, Samsung 57, and Sony 61. Now, if you've got above average net promoter score, that says to a potential acquiring business at some point, this business is going somewhere. It's offering really good service, and we're getting people out there that are advocates promoting the services and products because they're a fan of what we do. Now, if it's below, highlights opportunity for improvement. But here's the interesting thing. By getting this feedback now, even if you're not ready to sell, it's valuable because you can start to see how you need to refine your products and services to make sure that your customers and clients are referring and prepared to recommend your services. So, few statements to think about here outside of just pure net promoter score, because we're talking about here how likely customers are to recommend you. And I describe this as being what a customer's saying about you when you're not in the room. So do you have an above average net promoter score? Do you receive a high number of referrals from clients? So you might not be ready for a net promoter score, but in terms of referrals, are customers recommending you? Do you rate highly on review websites? Do you have written customer testimonials? Are customers prepared to be a reference? Do you have video customer testimonials? Do you have a referral scheme in place? So there's some other practical elements to look at that, again, in terms of creating freedom now to create those options in the future based on what you want or think you might do. These are great things to think about that add value to your business now. Final thing, hub and spoke. Just because a business is profitable doesn't mean it's valuable. Now, this links into a certain degree what we've covered previously, which is about the owner being responsible for clients, employees, and suppliers, which is a challenge. So what we're trying to do here is create less reliance on you and make a business to a certain degree the ability to move it around. You know, the hub and spoke system comes from, to a certain degree, within logistics, which is the ability to move around and have flexibility within the business model based on volume and based on the needs of the business. So how flexible is your business? How movable is it? So here's a few things to think about that links in with this dependence on you. Do you have no direct reports? 80% of your business doesn't come from 20% of your business in terms of number of clients. You are not personally responsible for supplier relationships. You don't own any client relationships. Clients don't ring you when there's a problem. Staff are going to your management team with challenges and they're not going to you. And the business could move location. Again, these are all reflective questions. Some of them you might not be able to answer at this stage because of the stage of where your business is at. But other areas you might be looking at and say, okay, I can see that I put a management in place, team in place, but I still got a high number of direct reports. Or actually, I can see that proportionally, we're getting a lot of our revenue from just a small number of clients. That makes it too dependable. Again, we're trying to make it independent.
Bill, on that, actually, we've got a question that's relevant to this section. So someone has posed, with the multiple roles for team members, do you see any value in some cross-training in small teams so that they can cover time off or have people who can do more than one job? So people in multiple roles, essentially.
That's a great question. I'd say there's another benefit to that by getting people to cross over in roles and understand the roles, is it educates them about what impact their role has on other people. Sometimes when individuals work within pure silos and they don't understand the impact of the overall business, we can get kind of conflict where a person's trying to do one thing, they're focused on what they're doing, but it's actually having a negative impact on another individual. So depending on where the business is at, based on its stage of growth, there can be that need. Now, that was particularly relevant during COVID and sickness. And as we come into the end of the year, probably relevant again, right, is there's a fair bit of sickness going around at the moment. So to build resilience in with your team, you might look at key individuals about how they might cross over. But the key with it, I would say, and the importance is structure. Not that everybody can do every job, but it gets to the point where if they need to, certain individuals can step into certain roles. It's a great question. So just a practical tip here. What have you done in the last year to make your business less dependent on you personally? List 2 specific actions you could take in the next 90 days to make your business less dependent on you personally. So,
Bill, just before we move on, we've got another question through actually. So how does that fit with early stage startups where it said that the founder has to connect with their customers and have direct conversations with clients, partners and suppliers? So in that very early stages of setting up a business.
Yeah, so let me draw this out for you, okay? So the E-Myth by Michael Gerber covers this really well. So what you do is you look at your business and you look at all the different roles that are needed within your business. Say you've just got yourself and maybe a little bit of support. So what we do is we define each of the roles that are needed in the business. Now, at the moment, the reality is, as an owner, you're probably going to be wearing all those hats and doing all those roles. But by documenting them out, as we generate the cash in the business and we've got good financial management, we know at what point we recruit for each role. And suddenly then we create the time for the business owner because that role then is done by someone else. And then as the business grows and generates cash, that gets taken off your hands. So we start by defining all the roles that are needed within the business, being clear on them to grow the business. Yes, you are going to be the person doing them at the moment, but as you generate the cash and the growth, you then basically replace yourself gradually. And the E-Myth describes it really well. I highly recommend that book because it sets out from the transition from sole trader or solo entrepreneur into building that team structure. Great question again. Keep them coming. If I can't answer all the questions from today, feel free to drop me a line and I'll pick that up with you directly. So just to go back to the key drivers that we've talked about: financial performance, growth potential, the Switzerland structure, the valuation teeter-totter, recurring revenue, monopoly control, customer satisfaction, and hub and spoke. So remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to create freedom now as you grow. But the ultimate goal is to build a valuable and sellable business, which gives you choices. Remember we said about that in terms of the options that you want. Just to re-highlight, do you remember those freedom options that we talked about? Some of these is to bring them back to the fore, what we're trying to build: ability to switch off, the ability to choose how much you want to work, the business that works for you, having clarity about the future and for my business, the financial means to do what I want when I want, no more team or people worries. So just the last minute or so, this is the valuation report by way of example. It is a very detailed, comprehensive report that looks at how you score within those key areas. This is what you receive if you request it. So I'm going to put within the Q&A section now. I'll stop sharing. I'll put the link to the form that I mentioned, so you can click on that, or you can email me at philipbudd@actioncoach.co.uk and you are welcome to get in contact, ask questions with me via that email address. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can contact me, but that page that we've created just makes it easier in terms of requesting a one-to-one with me and the valuation report. We've got about another 30 seconds or so before we wrap up, but any key learnings from everybody? Love you to get your feedback within the Q&A section. Anything coming through, Candy, as questions? Or
yeah, so we've got a few questions that I'll whiz through. So the name of the book, Phil, that you recommended, can you just sort of tell everyone what that was called again and who the author
so
was?
the model this is based on is by a guy called John Warrilow, that wrote a book called Built to Sell. And the other book that's very similar but touches upon some of the bits we've talked about in organizational structure is The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber. Tell you what, if people select a one-to-one with me and they want the valuation report, I'll give you a free copy of the book. The book's brilliant. I'll give out loads of versions of it, okay?
Oh, that's very kind of you, Phil. Really kind. Dean asks, he was a little bit late arriving to the webinar. Is there going to be a video version? Yes, there is, Dean, and that will be available on our website, hopefully in the next couple of days. And then thank you. So thank you to you, Phil. It's been really valuable and thought-provoking. And I think it definitely has. I know what you do. You do it so well, Phil. And it's all about getting people to take steps to think about their business and how they can build that value. So yeah, thank you for your time today.
So thanks everyone for your participation.
Real, thank you.